Hello and welcome to another Truth Proof live stream. So welcome everybody in the UK and around the world. And most of all, welcome Paul.
Thank you very much, Les. Have you had a good week?
We had a brilliant week and some great weather here in the UK, finally. So being able to get out and about, yeah.
Yeah, same here. I've, as anybody can see, I've had a little bit too much sun again, but that's life, innit? But great guest tonight. I'm really looking forward to speaking with Kathleen Marden. I really am. It's a story that's intrigued me for, well, I think many people in chat are just as intrigued. So all good. And while we're on with chat, Les, we've got quite a few people in already. I can see Mike the Disabled Welshman, Joey Hayes, Salima Carrick, Dragonborn, Barbara Davis, Bob O'Connell, Al Durham. Great to see you, Al. Rivington Pike Base, that's Lee. Martin Abbas, nice to see you, Martin. Not that it's nice to see everybody. And I know Lynn is in and Pete will be in. Susan 71, Sam Shelley, good to see you. Thudda and Karen Behrman. And I know that every time Storm, and I think Adam were in, Daniel Parks, Barbara Davis, Stargaze Returnal, Yorkshire Puffin, and I know that every time I say I know, more names to show up, and I've got to stop people. So apologies if I've not said your name. Janet B, Adam Sandor, Gavin Still Crazy, Deb Shaw. Let's go to it, Les.
Yeah, I think you've done it. It's a great show tonight, as you say, and I'll be in the background. If anybody has any questions for our guest tonight, I'll be there.
Yeah,
and,
questions in capitals, please.
Definitely. And we'll bring our guest onto the stage. Welcome, Kathleen.
Hello,
you.
Kathleen.
Hello.
Great to see you. Well, thank you for sharing some time with us today. And I would think that there are a wise lot, an educated lot, our people in chat, and they will have heard of this case that you're going to discuss with us and tell us a little bit about, well, hopefully a lot about. But for anybody that doesn't know, Kathleen Marden, considered one of the leading UFO contact researchers in the field today. And I don't think that's said lightly. That is the truth of it. Researching since the early 1990s, and few people have such an extensive knowledge of UFOs and their occupants. And I think it's fair to say that your interest in UFOs began primarily at the age of 13 in 1961, when your aunt, Betty and Barney Hill, had their experience encounter with something truly unknown. So, Kathleen, welcome to Truth Proof.
Thank you. So good to be with you.
No, absolutely thrilled to be speaking to you. It's an honor. But before we kind of jump into any of that, what about your family background and other family members prior to this? Did anybody have any experiences?
Well, prior to Betty and Barney having their experience, I didn't know this in 1961 on September 20th when my mother was on the phone with Betty. That is when my mother told me that she had had a UFO sighting a few years earlier. And she was with a different aunt, and they were on their Friday evening grocery shopping trip. And as they were driving down the road, over a field, they saw a large cigar-shaped object with smaller objects flying around it. They stopped the car and went to the home of some people they knew who lived across the street from that field. And so there were several witnesses to that. But my mother hadn't spoken of it.
Was that due to the stigma attached to it, or do you think she didn't think it, I don't know, it were worthy of speaking about?
Yeah, I don't have the slightest idea. I never asked her that question. I only know that it was on that day that she told me about her experience. She had told my aunt and uncle. Maybe it's because I was only 13 and she was fearful that I'd be frightened. You know, when I was a little kid when it happened. When my mother had her sighting.
So, you know, apart from that, then, as far as you're aware, your family hadn't got much experience or much sort of contact with anything of the unknown?
Not that I'm aware of.
No, it's fascinating. So before jumping into what happened in 1961, give us an outline, if you would please, of Betty and Barney. What were they like? What were they about as people? Because it'd be great to walk us into that. Then we get into the encounter.
Well, first I'll talk about their profession and their interests, and then I'll talk about them as family members. Yeah. So Betty was a social worker for the state of New Hampshire. Barney worked for the post office, and they were very civically minded. They belonged to the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and she was white and he was black. They were active in community affairs. Barney, when he lived in Philadelphia, had been a Boy Scout leader. So Betty had been the head of sort of liberal organization for students when she was in college. She always had a liberal mind. She was accepting of other people regardless of race or religion. She just saw everyone as people. So what mattered was the type of people they were. And Barney was a very nice person. He was not formally educated. He didn't go to college, but there were opportunities he missed because of his color,
right?
Of his race. He had been in the Army. He'd gone in just before the beginning of World War II. He had been injured. He was released, and he had excellent recommendation. That's probably why it was so easy for him to get a job with the post office. And so just a terrific person. I spent a lot of time with Betty as a child. I absolutely loved her. She was like a second mother to me, or favorite aunt, whatever you wanted to say. When she was in college and she was studying entomology, she would come to the family farm and she'd be running around with her butterfly net. And I was always interested. I was a scientifically interested kid. And so I was very interested in the work that she was doing, netting butterflies and insects and putting them with pins onto cardboard or some kind of board for her entomology class. She taught me a lot. So I was very close to her and grateful. I did a lot of things with Betty and Barney as well. Barney was a jolly person. All of the children in the family liked him. He was always joking around with us. He was playing like checkers and chess and games with us. We always looked forward to having him come. He was interested in our schoolwork, as was Betty. So they were very good role models for the children in the family.
And your obvious love for them both still shines through there. You can see it and all the way through it. So if you will, then can you start and walk us through that 19th of September experience? Am I right? What would you call it, Kathleen? Is it an abduction? Well, it is an abduction, isn't it? But
it was a close encounter. That's all that they knew at that time. Yeah. It was later through hypnosis where they remembered the abduction itself a couple of years later. But on September 19, 1961, they were returning home from a vacation trip. They'd gone to Niagara Falls, spent the night there. Then they traveled through Ontario, Canada. They stopped for the night in Ontario, 112 miles west of Montreal. Then they drove into Montreal the following day, and they were tourists. They were having a great day. They thought they would spend the night at a hotel, but and go back into the city for the nightlife. But Barney did not enjoy driving through cities. He got lost in Montreal. There was the language barrier. And when they were at the outskirts of the city, he decided that he was just going to drive on. And if they became tired, that they would stop for the night. So they continued driving toward New Hampshire, and they stopped at Magog along the way, a little tourist area, a nice, pretty little town. And then they stopped at Coaticook, which and they had a little snack there. They, of course, couldn't understand French, and so they thought they were ordering a meal, and they ended up with like potato chips and a soft drink. So they used up with the money that they had from Quebec, and then they headed south through Vermont. And by the time they arrived in northern New Hampshire, in Colebrook is the name of it, they stopped at a restaurant that was still open. It was after 9 o'clock at night, and they fueled up. They had a little snack in the restaurant, and then some coffee, and they headed south, and anticipating that they would arrive home at 3 o'clock. Barney and Betty felt great. They were finally in home territory that they had been to before. And so they started their drive toward Portsmouth, New Hampshire on the seacoast. As they were, they left the restaurant, they wound their watches, they checked the time against the clock in the restaurant, and they then proceeded south. It was about 10:05 p.m. Okay. So they're about a half hour or so south of there in Lancaster, New Hampshire, just south of Lancaster, when Betty sees a light moving in the sky, and it's moving very rapidly. And at first she wonders if it's a falling star or a satellite. Well, satellites don't move rapidly. She'd never seen a satellite though. And, but it was flying upward. So she was watching it. It was a bright, light night. The moon was about 3/4 full. And Barney continued driving. They're having a wonderful trip home. And they're both in a good mood. And they have their little dog, Delcy, with them. She was a little dachshund.
Yeah.
And so they are driving on. And Betty notices that this light in the sky is coming in closer and closer. And it becomes so close that it is obvious now that it's a craft. And so she asked Barney to stop. And this is just south of Twin Mountain at the Mount Cleveland picnic area. So he doesn't want to stop. He says, "I want to get home, Betty." And so Betty said, "But Delcy needs to walk."
So there's no urgency within them at this moment. That they're just intrigued with the light.
Right. No, there's no intrigue with it.
No, okay.
Yes. So they get out of the car. Betty grabs the binoculars and tells Barney, "Why don't you walk Delcy?" So he walks the dog, and Betty looks through binoculars, and she sees this object passing in front of the moon, flashing multicolored lights, and thinks that there's something unusual about it. Barney comes back with the dog. He is a confirmed skeptic. He doesn't believe any of this is possible. And so he says, "Give me the binoculars, Betty." He takes a look and he said, "Oh, it's probably just a Piper Cub or a commercial plane heading toward Montreal. Betty, forget about it. Get into the car. Let's head home." So they continue to drive. They're not far south of there when this craft comes in much closer. And they're now in Franconia Notch. They're in Franconia Notch. At that time, it was Route 3. It was a 2-lane highway. The mountains on each side of the road and a stream on one side of the road. And this is where the Old Man of the Mountain is located, where the Cannon Mountain ski area is located just before the Old Man. And so as they enter Franconia Notch, they see this light or this object passing over Cannon Mountain. And there's a building or something on top of Cannon Mountain, and the light on that building blinks out.
Really?
Yes, that could have...
Cutting across your, but I know you'll pick it up because I know that you know the story better than anybody. Did anybody check whether that building had suffered a power cut? Oh, nobody would have thought, I suppose, back then, would they?
No, nobody in that time frame thought,
No.
wondered if the power on top of that mountain was out. That was a ski area. It was building up there. There was a fire tower up there. And when I went up there during my investigations, I did years of investigation on that. There was like an airplane signal tower up there that flashed off and on, I think. And that was not there, or if it was lower in that time frame. I asked Betty about that. I went to that spot over and over again with Betty and with other investigators as well. So
I stopped you. So it passed over the building and the building blinked out, or the light.
Yes, it blinked out, and it could have been an indication of an electromagnetic field. We're not certain. There's no way to know for certain. No. Then they were passing by the Old Man of the Mountain, which was a structure. It was a rock formation that looked like an old man's profile with a beard. And
there, what a question! So you've answered it. Thank you. I was going to ask what was the Old Man of the Mountain. So thank you. Yeah,
yes, and it was a state symbol at the time. It fell off the mountain in 2003, unfortunately, into the lake below. But as Betty and Barney were driving along, they noticed that it had stopped beside the old man's profile. So they stopped the car by the side of the road. It looks very different there today. There's a super highway that goes through it, and a huge area to pull off. And you have to walk down to that area where the state has erected a sign. But in those days, you could just pull over to the side of the road, get out. Yeah. So they did. They had their binoculars. They're looking up at this, what looked like a cigar-shaped craft in that time frame that was lighted. And then they said that it was rotating. And as it rotated, they could see that it was lighted on only one side. And they then got back into the car. But Betty told me during my investigation that it was at least as long as, or 1.5 times as long as the old man's profile, which was 48 feet from forehead to chin.
So that was good, so that's given the reference, hasn't it? You've been outside of that, yeah.
Of the size of the craft, yes. So then they're back in the car. Barney is noticing how this object is bouncing back and forth in the sky. He describes it as looking like a yo-yo, and you let go of the yo-yo and it moves out and then it comes back to you. It reminds me of what the Air Force officers who have seen these things describe as being like a ping pong ball going back and forth. Yeah. So they probably were observing the same kind of motion. So Betty is seeing it then traveling in a stair-step pattern too. So very erratic, unusual kind of flight pattern.
And silent as well.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, it was silent. So they're moving on again. They exit Franconia Notch, the southern exit, and they're now in Lincoln, New Hampshire. And the first thing you see when you arrive in Lincoln, the town of Lincoln, is cabins. There were overnight cabins. This was the off season. I don't think they have an off season anymore with the population being so large, but it was the off season then. Not many people on the road. They went by, which was the Indian Head Resort, which had a lot of cabins in that time frame. And they continue driving down Route 3 when this object surges ahead. And Barney has to stop the car directly in the middle of the road, so he won't be directly under it, because it's hovering beside the road and it's only 200 feet above them.
So how much time has elapsed since seeing it near the Old Man of the Mountain then? Do we think the driving time?
Yeah,
How long?
Maybe 15 to 20 minutes.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. And so they're there. It's now about midnight or a little after. He has stopped the car in the middle of the road. He leaves the lights on, the motor running. He grabs the binoculars. He gets out of the car. He rests his elbows on the roof of the car, and he's looking up at this into the windows, and he's seeing what he at that point said is no longer looks like a cigar shape. He can now see the full form of the structure, that it reminds him of a giant pancake. And there is a row of windows that he's looking through. They are a bright, bright, intense blue-white light. He steps away from the car for a better view, and when he does, that craft shifts position. It crosses across the road in front of him, and he walks down the road. Betty remains in the car in the passenger seat, because remember, the car is running and it's in the middle of the road.
Yeah.
So Barney goes to the edge of the road to near where that craft is. It's now only 100 feet overhead. He's looking up at it through binoculars, shaking his head, pulling the binoculars down, shaking his head again. He cannot believe what his eyes are seeing. It is completely silent. There are figures dressed in black, shiny uniforms looking down at him. Suddenly, all but one move away from the windows to what appears to be a wall or a panel of some kind. He can see them from the tops of their heads. He can see their arms going up. He can see them to their knees. He can see them without the binoculars as well. And suddenly, little red lights on fin-like structures slide out, 2 of them on each side. And then something starts to drop down out of the bottom. And at this point, Barney becomes terrified. He rips the binoculars away from his eyes so forcefully that it breaks the leather strap. And he runs as fast as he can back to the car, screaming to Betty that they had to get out of there or they were going to be captured. As he entered the car, he turned, he looked up, and that craft was now moving in his direction. All of this is a conscious recall. I want to make that clear, not brought out through hypnosis the first time. He then starts driving very rapidly down the highway, and within minutes, he and Betty hear a series of code-like sounds striking the trunk of the car. And I think that you call it the bonnet.
Yeah.
Right? Where they had their suitcases.
Yeah.
Yes.
The boot.
Okay. The boot.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yeah.
And so they had their suitcases.
This is a clicking type of sound then, is it?
They hear a buzzing sound.
Oh, so, yeah, right.
Not a clicking. It's a code-like buzzing sound that's striking the trunk of their car.
So they could not just audibly, they could actually feel it hitting the car, could they?
They could feel it in the car itself. It caused the car to vibrate. It caused an electrical tingling sensation to pass through their bodies. And the next thing they knew, they were no longer in that spot. They were at least 30 to 35 miles down the highway. They had vague memories of Well, before I tell you about the vague memories, they're down the highway and they hear a second series of these buzzing sounds, but they don't see the craft this time. They have vague memories, Betty more than Barney, of being on a dirt road with tall trees all around, no longer on the highway. They remembered a fiery orb that appeared to be sitting on the ground, and they remembered a roadblock. They didn't know where or when that occurred. It was extremely confusing. They had a desire for contact with other humans, and they didn't see anyone on the way home. They were looking for a police officer, a coffee shop that might be open, that sort of thing. Nothing was open. And so they finally arrived home. And instead of finding that it was 2 or 3 in the morning, it was, I have Betty's watch. It was no longer running when she arrived home. She looked at the clock. She set that watch, and it was 5:15 a.m. when she set it. So Barney's watch was not running either. Both were broken. Barney did not take the luggage into the house in that time frame. He waited until later. They took long showers. They felt that craft was so close to them, they might have been contaminated. They then had breakfast and they sat down and they drew pictures or sketches of what they had observed when it was hovering over that field.
And I take it Barney now had gone from skeptic to full-on believer. I mean, you can't experience something like that and not do, can you?
And no, you can't. Yes, he did know that this was real at this point. So, they slept. They were tired. They slept for a few hours. And then Betty called my mother. Barney said to Betty, first, don't tell anyone about this. No good can come of it. So Betty walked to the phone and picked it up and called my mother.
Right.
My mother was at home ironing clothing. And when I walked into the house after school that afternoon, the ironing board is up in the kitchen. And she was a chain smoker. She's smoking a cigarette and she's on the phone with Betty. And I overheard their conversation. My mother's end of it, because I couldn't hear Betty's voice.
No.
And so
and were they a buzzing air for you? Because you could tell something really strange or interesting were being spoken about.
Yes, I absolutely knew that something very unusual was being discussed and that my mother was concerned. And she said to Betty, well, I'll call, and I'm not going to say his name, but our neighbor, he was a physicist.
Yeah.
So when he arrived home from work, my mother called him. Right after my mother hung up the phone, she said that Betty and Barney had seen a flying saucer the previous night. And I said, what do you mean flying saucer? And she said, oh, something that's come here from another planet. And I said, well, in school, we learned that no other planets are inhabited. How could that be? And my mother said to me, well, I saw one many years ago. And so that's when I found out about that. So I was a very curious child. My favorite books were Nancy Drew mysteries. I wanted to grow up and be a detective like Nancy Drew. And so I wanted to go to Betty's and Barney's house as soon as possible.
Sorry, Kathleen.
Go ahead. Go right ahead.
I'm curious. Once when your mum had been told this encounter, there were no disbelief in your mum. If Betty told her, she knew Betty were being straight up. No, she didn't question it. She just knew that this was the truth. Yeah.
Yes, she absolutely did. Betty wasn't a liar. She was.
Oh no, I'm not trying to say that. I'm just trying to gauge your mum's reaction, and obviously rest at family because they will have found out that
Yes.
Afterward. Yeah.
Yes, obviously, my mother and Betty were close. She was the first one Betty called, and my mother had had her own sighting previously. So
Yeah.
I talked my father into taking us to Betty's and Barney's house within a day or two. And I got to hear Betty's memories with my own ears. Went out and saw the spots on the trunk of the car that caused the compass needle to spin. They were in the same location where they heard the buzzing sounds striking the car that caused the needle to spin on the compass, indicating that a magnetic field was present. So I saw that with my two little brothers and my mother, and went back in. My father was sitting quietly in a corner with Barney. Betty warned us that we should not bother Barney that day. I think he was deeply disturbed by what occurred. He was waiting for a phone call from the Pease Air Force Base. They'd already made a report, but they were going to call him back. My father told me years later that they sat quietly and discussed what Barney had observed through the windows of that craft. And he told me that Barney was very clear about what he saw, that it wasn't a light in the sky, it was a structured craft, everything that I've told you. And that is in the first reports that Betty and Barney made as well.
It's an incredible book, and this is the first one, isn't it? I know you've updated it, haven't you?
Yes. I have the updated book now, the 60th anniversary edition.
Yeah.
With new evidence, the scientific evaluation of more evidence, because I've never stopped searching for scientists who would evaluate the evidence.
Well, I know you're walking us through this, and that's what I want, but or what our audience want. But how long then? Because obviously, as a 13-year-old girl, you're not researching, but in a way you are, because you're absorbing all this information. But when do you think you actually started down the road of I'm going to document all of this?
Well, the first time I wrote about it was when I was in high school.
All right.
But I did not mention Betty's and Barney's names because of the confidentiality agreement. I wasn't permitted to tell anybody. Betty and Barney didn't want anyone except for scientists, Air Force, close friends, and family to know about this, and UFO investigators. So that's the first time I wrote about it. I met many of the original investigators, Walter Webb, Robert Homan, and C.D. Jackson, who were scientists. I went to dinner with Betty and Barney to Dr. Simon's home, where I met John Fuller and another scientist. So all the way through this, I was
you on
meeting.
this journey with them, didn't they? You
Yes,
lived it.
I lived it with them. After it was made public, violation of
1965, they made it.
Yes, violation of confidentiality that carried that story to the public in 5 newspaper articles. Betty and Barney were extraordinarily distressed. We had a family meeting. I was at that meeting where the family made a group decision that it would be okay for Betty and Barney to talk about this UFO sighting, but not the abduction itself. So a few days later, they spoke at the Unitarian Church in Dover, New Hampshire. They were introduced by the public information officer from Pease Air Force Base, who spoke about other UFO sightings in the area. And then Betty and Barney went on and spoke to the public. At that point, John Fuller approached them. He was in the audience, and he was a professional author, wrote for the Saturday Review, wrote books, and so on and so forth. He'd had articles published in Look magazine about, I guess that was later, though. It was about the Condon report. But he was a professional writer. He wanted to write their story. They discussed that with the family as well. And they agreed to do it as long as Dr. Benjamin Simon was involved as well. He was the neuropsychiatrist who did the hypnosis sessions with Betty and Barney, beginning a couple of years after. And I have to say, at great expense to Betty and Barney. The reason they ended up with him is because Barney had been hospitalized with bleeding ulcers, this life-threatening condition. He was suffering from trauma as a result of this event.
So it definitely changed people after the event.
Absolutely. It changed them radically.
And before I butted in and asked you something else, you were saying as a young girl, you went and spoke to them with your parents, and you were told not to bother Barney. How long, obviously because he'd got a lot on his mind after just experiencing that, how long did it take before he started talking to you guys about it a bit more openly?
Well, Betty and Barney came down to visit at least once a week.
Right.
My grandparents lived right across the street from my childhood home. And so we would see them. Betty would talk about it over and over and over again. Barney would become distressed and he would leave and he'd go wander the backlands of the family farm. Finally, and I'm not certain precisely what year it was before they saw Dr. Simon. We were trying to help Barney because he was so distressed. We were trying to help him remember. He and Betty would actually drive up to that area of the White Mountains time and time again to try to find that dirt road that they found themselves on.
This is one that 35 miles down the road after Barney had run to the car.
Yes. Yeah. And the dirt, not where they found themselves 35 miles down the road. They were back on the highway, but wherever this strange place was with the tall trees all around and the dirt road and the roadblock and the fiery orb. So we would try to help Barney to jog his memory. And one afternoon he was sitting there and he had a very powerful abreaction, release of emotions. And he remembered them in the road and how they were not walking like humans and how one of them was carrying a light and that he was terrified when he was remembering that. But it was a huge emotional release. It was shocking to me as a teenager to be sitting at the dining room table when all of this is occurring. And
were they a trigger then that made him remember that? Were you actually, were Betty trying to talk him through events, or did it just come and, it just came back to him? Was there any particular part of a conversation that triggered that release of the memory?
Yes, it was the conversation, because we were going, well, what happened next? What do you remember next? And then suddenly, he's sitting in the vehicle in his memory, and he's looking at those non-humans, and they're the ones that he saw in the craft, and became terrified. He, at that point, realized that they had been taken. There was all this physical evidence: Betty's torn dress, Barney's scraped dress shoes that were so badly damaged that he had to buy new shoes, that sort of thing. But boy, this was very powerful. So this probably happened in 1964.
The actual release of the memory.
Yes. Yeah. And then he saw Dr. Benjamin Simon for the first time in December of 1963, or it might have been 63 when he had this abreaction. Yeah. He saw Dr. Simon then, and then he started to see, and Betty saw Dr. Simon beginning in January of 1964. He went through their story. He conditioned them for hypnosis. He never believed that this could possibly happen. He was just like Barney was before Barney knew that it was real. And so he took Betty and Barney separately for hypnosis sessions. He recorded those sessions. One remained in the waiting room with bombastic music playing. He introduced amnesia for each of them after the session. Excuse me, my eyes are burning. It's allergy season.
Okay, no problem.
And so they could not remember. They'd stop by on their way home sometimes, depending upon how tired they were. And then at the end of their hypnosis sessions, Dr. Simon worked with them together. He asked them if they would like to listen to what the other one said in hypnosis. And he started to play the hypnosis tapes back to them, and so that they could live through it, so they could experience it again, and so they could express their emotional feelings, that sort of thing, integrating all of this. Dr. Simon tried to talk them out of believing that they were abducted. He was willing to believe that they might have seen a UFO. He saw a couple of UFOs in his past, but Betty and Barney were willing to consider it. But then with all of the evidence and all of the conscious recall, they just couldn't accept his hypothesis.
And how did the doctor feel when they were unshakable, because they've actually had this experience and they're not going to bend their story to suit his narrative? Did it conflict with what he was trying to do with them?
Oh, I have letters from him to them, and back and forth. So he was concerned for them, for these memories, but he said, well, nobody knows for certain. We all have to wait until there's scientific evidence indicating whether or not this could actually have happened. That was his initial response.
Yeah.
And he maintained that response with Betty and Barney for many years, up until 1985. 85? When, am I right? 85 or 75? I don't remember. When the movie came out.
Yeah.
The movie
75.
75 is the UFO incident.
Yeah.
And I'm struggling with a little brain fog from COVID still.
Kathleen,
so excuse
it's
me.
so difficult. With the books I've written, if somebody asked me something, I can't just pick it out of my head. Even though you've written it and you've done all this work, so your recall of these events is amazing. So I'm as interested as everybody else in this chat, and so
yes. So in 1975, Barney was dead. In 1969, he had a brain aneurysm and died. Betty was alone. She was investigating all of this. She was a UFO investigator at this point for the APRO, the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, and was doing her own unconventional experiments, and was working with a team of scientists she had in 1965 and through 67, doing what we think of as CE5 experiments to try to call in craft, that sort of thing. And Dr. Simon wrote that he believed at that point, he wrote it to the debunker, Phil Klass, that at that point he was concerned about the American public, about frightening the American public. So he made the decision to speak out at that point against the reality of the real event that Betty and Barney experienced. And I'm saying real event because we have so much evidence today.
Do you know, and that must have hurt them after pouring all that emotion, all those experiences in the hypnotic regression sessions and everything. It must have been quite hurtful to be as truthful as that and then get knocked back. Do you think they were his opinions, or do you think he'd been steered in that direction by some higher echelon of power? Well,
he was a lieutenant colonel in the military during World War II. He'd set up the psychiatric unit at the Mason General Hospital on Long Island, chief of neuropsychiatry. It makes me wonder if the military was involved. He was a consultant to the military still when he saw Betty and Barney. And I think that he might have been influenced by the debunker, Philip Klass, who visited him at his home and warned him, probably. I know that he used to warn other people about their allegiance to the US government. And also, Dr. Simon was concerned about his own reputation. I've been to the archival collections. I've physical archives to do research as well. And in John Fuller's archive in Boston, Massachusetts, I read about the concern that Dr. Simon had about his reputation, because some of his colleagues were writing to him, do you want to be remembered as the psychiatrist who went down in history as treating two people who had been abducted by aliens? You know, so it's still everything. People thought that anyone who even mentioned this was kooky back in those days. So
it's sad, though, isn't it, to think that we'd let reputation and you're standing in the field getting road of truth. Do you know it's not a nice thing to kind of reflect on. I bet for yourselves, is it? You know, as a family, when you no, I bet it isn't. No. So
most of the family hasn't come forward. Betty appointed me to be her spokesperson. I'm the trustee and executor of her estate. I set up her archival collection at the University of New Hampshire. And of course, I had my own set of archival records as well in my personal collection. So yes, but no, my family is just a normal family. People are going about their everyday lives, working at jobs, educated people with high standing in the communities. So, you know, they're pretty invisible.
Yeah. So then, what were we? September 1961. Is that the correct date? It was, wasn't it? 19th. Did you through the course of your research, did you discover if there was any more UFO sightings or I wouldn't say similar, because it's pretty unique. I think if there'd have been something like this happened in that date and that year, we would have heard about it. But did you find more UFO sightings around that same time frame?
I did. I found newspaper articles of UFO close encounters with UFOs in that time frame with multiple witnesses. I also have a letter that Stanton Friedman wrote to John Luttrell. And John Luttrell was the journalist for the Boston Traveler. And he broke that story against Betty's and Barney's wishes. In fact, Betty and Barney hired a lawyer to try to stop it. But he had done his own research, his own investigation. He'd contacted the Air Force, Project Blue Book, NICAP, investigators, people who knew Betty and Barney, their neighbors even.
Yeah.
And John had found 12 to 14 individuals who saw the craft that night. And in this letter, he wrote that they were not in a group together, they were in different locations, and that he knew that he was observing the same thing that Betty and Barney were observing, because he drew lines between them and between the location that Betty and Barney were in from each of those, and they all intersected.
Right.
When he wrote the newspaper articles, he had 6 witnesses, but others came forward later. And then I've had witnesses who came forward to me. There were 2 Navy men who saw a craft that night heading. They were in Maine, southern Maine, and this craft was heading toward the location in New Hampshire where Betty and Barney saw the craft. Also, there was a truck driver. And on one of the days when I was visiting Betty, she was on the phone with this truck driver who was telling her that he had seen the craft that night as well. And oh boy, I was a UFO investigator at that time. I wanted to take his report, and he refused to give his name or to let me investigate this. So unfortunately, I overheard the conversation, but could not go further with it.
What we're looking at 63, 64 years ago, thereabouts. Well, I know it would excite you, kind of thing, but do you live in hope that you still might get some other witness? I mean, it's not it's not out of the realms of possibility that somebody else still might have information that could add to this. I mean, Philip Mantle, you'll probably know Philip, and Dr. Irene Scott. They managed to unearth more witnesses from Pascagoula, didn't they?
Yes, they did. He and Irina, whom I greatly respect both of them.
Yeah.
Irina is a friend, and yes, other witnesses could come forward. I've met with people when I was doing my investigation in upstate New Hampshire too, but they didn't want to come forward with their names. So, but I found other people who had seen craft that night. And, so yes, there are others, but I'm looking for the scientific evidence. And there has been more work done on the star map, more work done on the analysis on Betty's dress as well. DNA.
So the dress is still in existence.
The dress is in existence. I put it into the archival collection at the University of New Hampshire, where it's being preserved as the trustee of the estate. If a scientist wants to do an investigation on that dress, then they have to write to me, and they have to request the sample. And then I have to go to the university, which is a long distance for me. I don't go to New Hampshire anymore because I've moved south. But I have done that in the past. And we do have new evidence, some exciting DNA evidence from the lining in the area of Betty's navel. If you remember, under hypnosis, she remembered that the examiner had placed a needle into her navel. And I was at the University of New Hampshire with Ben Hansen, who he might be a familiar name. He is the host of many television programs here. And so I was doing a television program with Ben. And he used to work for the FBI. We were examining the lining of the dress. I'd examined it before, of course. And he was interested in this spot, in the 3 spots, actually, fairly large, in the area of Betty's navel, on the lining. And he looked at it. It had not come from the outside in. She hadn't spilled something. She hadn't drooled.
Inside out,
it was from the inside out, and it looked like blood to him. Well, I had a disc with Betty's blood on that disc, so it made it possible to do a DNA analysis. So I cut from that area of the dress, a little sample. I sent it to MUFON's biological laboratory, the Mutual UFO Network, and their scientist did a DNA analysis. She used a test that would work with very old samples, and she was able to discover that this was fluid from Betty's body. So it came from the inside out onto the lining, which suggests that her memory of this needle in the navel might be real.
Yeah.
I think it's pretty good evidence. So I was excited by that. There was another scientist from a major university, a professor with a tenured professor, 35 years. And another professor who had taught the student how to do this analysis, and they were analyzing the dyes in Betty's dress. And so the man who was an expert on this was helping the student do it. And they found all of the dyes that made up Betty's dress, but they also discovered 2 elements on that dress there should be no reason for them to be there. One is tellurium, which is extremely rare in the Earth's crust, but highly present in the universe. High melting point, very hard, very expensive. And then rhodium, also very rare in the Earth's crust. So that's exciting news to me.
Yeah, that would have been my question. I bet you'd be waiting for some kind of eureka moment when you find the presence of something that, pardon the pun, is totally alien to what should be present on the dress, and you found it.
It was a eureka moment that although it can be found in the Earth's crust, it's extremely rare.
You don't
and the properties, right. And the scientists just said that they could not believe they found this on Betty's dress. There's no explanation that they could think of for how it got there. A prosaic explanation, that is.
Fabulous. I'm going to go to Les, Kathleen, in a moment and see if we've got any questions.
Sure.
And then, obviously, I'm just hoping you're going to just keep rolling and telling us more. I'm just enthralled. It's a real treat listening to you share this information with us. So I don't know whether we've got questions, have we, Les?
Well, sorry, I'm nearly swallowed the mint. Yes, great show, Kathleen, and thanks. It's an honour and a privilege to have you on the show.
Thank you.
Say that, yeah. Some fantastic questions have come in, as always. A very knowledgeable audience we have out there, Kathleen. Gavin's Still Crazy is a little bit annoyed because not against you, Kathleen, as much as you've already answered his question. Question for Kathleen: has there been any further analysis on Betty's dress she was wearing during the abduction? And you've just gone and explicitly told us about that.
Yes, and in my book, my new book, the 60th anniversary edition of Captured, I go into great detail with the scientific reports. So you can read the scientific reports there.
So more info for you there, Gavin. And that's great.
Okay, so Bacapa, hi Kathleen. Did Betty and Barney have any follow-up encounters after the famous event?
Betty and Barney had sightings after that event, and Betty never wanted to admit that she had further abduction events, but because she was so heavily ridiculed by the skeptics. But I'm aware that she did, because I have her hypnosis tapes with Dr. James Harder, who was the chief scientist for APRO, and he was interviewing her about other encounters, and she did say that they came back about once a year. And then I interviewed a friend of Betty's, and he and Betty were driving home from my childhood home to her house in Portsmouth at night, and it's about 20 miles. And so a craft came down beside the vehicle. They felt as if they were going up a hill, and the next thing they knew, the car was being put back down on the ground closer to the town of Exeter, so probably 5 or 6 miles away.
Incredible.
Amazing. And thanks for the question. And Adam Sander is asking something similar. Did Betty and Barney experience any other type of phenomena which you've just commented?
Yeah, well, there was other phenomena.
Well,
that they experienced.
Don't answer that, Kathleen, Adam, because I was going to ask about residue phenomena and things around the home afterwards. Okay. So we can jump in. We'll do that. Thanks, Adam.
Yeah, and not so much a question, but from Al Durham. Had the privilege of meeting Kathleen a few years back and would like to say thank you for being so patient in responding to my questions and giving time.
Well, it's so nice to see you again, Al, or to hear from you. And thank you so much for your comment. It was my pleasure to speak with you.
is a great guy, Alan. He really is. We'll consider him a good friend. Absolutely.
So was that in the UK when I was speaking there?
It will have been in UK. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want to say where it is? I'll just drop it down into a comment if you want, mate. But yeah, absolutely diamond, that fella. Okay, let's.
Rivington Paint Beast Lee Roscoe question: when the story first broke, Kathleen, what's the one thing that made you believe their story at the time?
Well, it was, as I said, the day they returned home that the story broke to me. And I knew them. I saw some of the evidence right away. I saw their emotional reaction. I was with them every step of the way as this unfolded. So I was a firsthand witness to all of this. So, naturally, I didn't have difficulty believing the story when I saw what they went through.
Well, the way you describe Barney's absolute trauma, you've painted a picture. This man was traumatized, wasn't he? Absolutely.
He was. And I loved Barney as I loved Betty. And they were just such nice family members. So naturally you're concerned about your family.
Okay, Les.
Al Durham again. Thanks, Al, for asking this. New Hampshire is known for the Free State Project, and as the live free or die state has, and I don't know this.
Has there been any other significant?
Has there been any other significant UFO cases in the state? And do you feel if there is there a link?
There were definitely other significant UFO cases in the state of New Hampshire. When I was living up there as an investigator for the Mutual UFO Network, I interviewed people. I went and investigated. UFO abduction at Exeter case took place in, just in the town next to 2 towns away from Portsmouth, 1 town away from, or 2 towns away from where Betty grew up, where I was living as a child. And that involved a young man who had graduated from high school and was going to go into the service, and 2 police officers. It was a close encounter. The craft hovered at treetop level. So yes, some highly significant cases. I investigated that case and wrote about it in my book with Stanton Friedman, Fact, Fiction, and Flying Saucers.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that, Sir Kathleen. Mark Jones. Kathleen, why don't aliens take over the TV networks and broadcast their presence instead of appearing before people no one will believe?
Well, as I said, I've worked on 3 major studies on about 5,000 experiencers, and we had open-ended questions. And I've also done an unorthodox communication experiment where I've gotten replies as well. So my answer to that is, it's sort of, think of the Star Trek Prime Directive. The extraterrestrials tell their humans that they do not want to interfere with life on our planet, that they work quietly. They're attempting to upgrade us. They say that they've come here from time to time throughout our history to assist in our development. They're very, very concerned at this point about our use of nuclear weapons. They say that our technological development is out of sync with our spiritual growth, and that when this imbalance occurs, it could lead to the destruction of life on the planet. It's happened elsewhere. They're extraordinarily concerned about this, and also about humans' aggressive behavior toward one another, our failure to even care about our environment to save our planet, that sort of thing. Those are the messages that the ETs pass on to humans over and over and over again.
And you can see where Mark the direction Mark's question's gone, and it's a good question, Mark, but
Yes.
we might overestimate our importance in the grand scheme of all this as well. You know, why would they want to announce their presence to the full populace? They might not want to do that, and somebody such as Barney and Betty might be just as important to this intelligence, this non-human intelligence, as the president of America. You know, we don't know what they're ultimately what they're thinking, do we? We're not inside their minds.
We can't know for certain. That's that's for sure, that we don't know what's going on. We can only know what they have informed the experiencers that they have taken, that they've communicated with. And now there are people all over the world who are doing CE5 experiments and observing craft close up, and the non-humans on the craft as well, and acquiring more information.
CE5, and obviously it's nothing new, is it? If Betty were performing this just under a different name, or not even named even, and all we're doing, I mean, I've said it, Les has heard me say this, I'm just walking in the footsteps of other people. We're all doing that, you know.
The scientists were giving her a script to read to try to send this telepathic message to the ETs to show up or to land in certain areas, and then they would go out and look. They called it psychophysics experiments in those days. So I don't know if there was anyone before Betty who was doing this kind of thing, but she was working with the scientific team quietly.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks for that. Kathleen, just a follow-up question from me, I guess, at this point. You say then that these ETs, stroke aliens, they want to do their work, you know, with just people, and they'd want to do it in the background. Did you say secretly?
Yes, they were. These scientists were working secretly with Betty and Barney.
Oh yeah, yeah. So, do these ET/aliens, do they actually work with government officials? I mean, it was reported in the 1940s that the craft had landed on the White House lawn. Kathleen, is that?
No, craft didn't land on the White House lawn. It was in 1952 when there were craft over Washington, D.C. Military jets were scrambled to see the craft. It was on radar. There were, in 1952, there were many people up and down the East Coast who had close encounters with craft, and across the United States. And I think that it was as far away as Japan where the craft were observed.
That's put me right. Yeah.
One sec, Les. Just to answer this, Deb Shaw's just put, there was a guy in Arizona doing his own version of CE5 in the 1950s.
Is that so?
Yeah, it's interesting. Drop the name in, Deb, and I don't know whether it'd be any relevance to Kathleen, but it's still good. Yeah.
Yes, I'd love to know his name.
Yep. Okay, Les, come on.
Yeah, a similar question that we had earlier from Andrew Sheehan. Question for Kathleen: did Betty or Barney experience any more of the type of phenomena after this incident?
Yeah, well, we're probably going to touch on that and the residue when we've done with these questions.
Okay.
Yes,
question
so I guess I've
from
answered.
Karina Selby. Can I ask about the craft going back and forth? Did they say it was what speed it was, rapid or slow?
It was rapid.
I've seen what sounds similar. It was fast and seemed to defy physics. It seemed impossible. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
And let's have a look. I think we've done this one as well. Might disable Welsham, but I'll put it on the screen.
Yeah, well, we have done it.
Yeah, we've done that one. If you want to just check, you probably heard the answer to that one.
Is it true that there was dust on the dress after the incident? Dust not from planet Earth. Well, you've covered that quite extensively, haven't you, Kathleen? Thank you.
Okay, question from Barry Donovan. What does Kathleen think about the integrity of Sitchin's Anunnaki work? Does she think it's valid?
It appears to be a good investigation by Zachariah Sitchin. I'm interested in his work. I haven't read all of his books because I'm so focused on my personal research, but I'm very interested in some of his work and discovery of Anunnaki and the Sumerian texts and that sort of thing.
Thank you. I'm glad you said that as well, because I'd find that I get very little time to read or do all else because I'm so absorbed in my own thing. So, yeah.
You'll probably see the next question from Andrew Sheehan. Did Betty or Barney ever have to pass a lie detector test?
Barney was dead when Betty had her lie detector test. She was tested by the famous lawyer F. Lee Bailey, who had a great deal of experience with this, and the president of the lie detector or the Polygraph Association in the United States. This was on a television show titled, I think it was the Lie Detector Show, and Betty passed with flying colors.
Which is telling. That's brilliant.
Yes.
Yeah. O'Connell, could Kathleen please give some insight into the Unitarian Church, please?
Okay, so the church itself, I guess, of this church that they spoke at, I'm not sure. They were members of the Unitarian Church. The Unitarian Church is a liberal church. They were regular members at the Portsmouth, New Hampshire Unitarian Church. Their initial minister was John Papandrew, who was a black man, like Barney. And Betty and Barney were extraordinarily interested in participating in the civil rights work that was the church was interested in as well, and became envoys to the United Nations through that church. So yes, they had a long-standing relationship with that church.
I suppose before you go to another question, Leslie, how was their story, their experience received by the people within the church, the congregation of the church, accepting, or were they shunned in some quarters?
No, they were. It was my understanding that it was accepting, and not only that, but the minister hosted a group of Air Force officers and Betty and Barney. And they all discussed what could have caused the buzzing sound striking the trunk of the car. And they were wondering if it was some kind of like sonar.
Right.
So, there were Air Force officers, naval officers who believed that this was real. They knew it was real. And they were giving emotional support to Betty and Barney.
Fabulous. Thank you.
That helped.
Yeah. Mike, the disabled Welshman, did Barney ever suffer what we call these days PTSD?
Absolutely, he did. That was the cause of his bleeding ulcers, his difficulty sleeping, his high blood pressure, the emotional distress, all of it. It was today we'd call it post-traumatic stress disorder, and also the psychiatric term would be conversion hysteria, where the emotional intensity created these physiological problems.
Okay, thanks for that. John Doe, hi Kathleen. Was this the first ever recorded abduction? Were people at the time even aware of the term alien abduction?
It was the first recorded investigated abduction in the United States. No one knew about it before that in the United States, but there had been an abduction that took place in Brazil. I believe it was 1957. Antonio Villas Boas, who was a farmer, was out working in the field at night with his brother, and a craft. They had a sighting of this craft, and then a few nights later, this craft came. He was on the tractor. The entities from the craft captured him and took him to the craft and gave him a tour of the craft. And he ended up becoming a lawyer. He went to law school. He is no longer living, but he went to his death still claiming that this was real, swearing that it was real. It was well investigated in Brazil. We didn't know about it in the United States until long after Betty and Barney's experience. I think it was like 1966, 1967 that it was made, we were made aware of it, but not on a wide basis in the United States.
Thank you. And Deb Shaw says she's going to try and find that name for the CE5 guy. But then I see David Bancroft, and I hope it's the right name, David. I hope you're not playing games with me. George Van Tassel. He says, Deb, it was George.
Oh, okay. Yes, I'm aware of who he was.
Yeah, thanks, David.
Yes.
So there we go.
Gavin Still Crazy. Kathleen, have you had any experiences you can talk about, or is this something you're going to move on to?
Well, we can touch on any of Kathleen's experiences when you're winding questions up. We'll do questions again 10, 15 minutes towards wrapping this up, if that's okay, Kathleen.
Okay.
And I don't know whether you need a break for a drink of water or anything, do you? Everything
I'm
good?
doing fine.
Excellent.
I'm doing fine.
More questions if you want, Les. It's up to you.
Okay, I've got to sort some out, so I'll be back a little bit later on.
Okay, thanks, Les. Well, thanks for that. And so, it's just unbelievable, isn't it? I want to know, if possible, you could share with us Barney's and Betty's, but more so Barney, because I think he probably got a better view of these beings. What did he describe them as looking like?
I have his written descriptions to the artist who did the original paintings, and Betty's as well. They had very larger chests than humans. They were shorter. There were two groups of them. One about 4 feet, 3.5 to 4 feet tall. One 5 feet to 5'4" inches tall, and of course, dressed in black, shiny, one-piece uniforms. They were completely hairless. Their skin was kind of a grayish color. From what they could see, it was blue lighting on the craft at a bluish tone. They had a slit for a mouth. Of course, they communicated telepathically, but when they opened their mouths to communicate with one another in kind of a strange kind of sound, they could see a membrane inside this mouth. They had broad faces, but little tiny chins that sort of came to a point. Barney called it a weak chin. They had larger eyes than humans, and they wrapped around a little bit for peripheral vision. They saw mostly the iris of the eye, the colored part of the eye, that filled up most of that area. There was also a pupil, and there was a little yellow color where the white would be. No external ears. The nose was just almost flat, but slightly upturned, flared nostrils. Heads larger in proportion to their bodies than ours. Spindly arms, spindly legs. So go ahead and ask your question.
Well, you would. So thin legs, thin arms. They don't sound very strong then, do they? Obviously, they're using some other means to apprehend Barney, who I'm assuming
they use technology.
Physical type of guy. What he, strong. They
used different technology. As I said, Barney felt like he was floating. He felt that he was supported under his arms, but only the toes of his shoes were bumping along the rocks. So he felt floating. So they must have been using some kind of device, I would think, to move him along. They weren't dragging him. Betty, they pointed some kind of device, almost like a little wand, at her twice so that she would lose consciousness. or become semi-conscious. So they were using technology.
And when they were communicating with Betty, and Betty were determined to remember. She wasn't going to forget. And I don't know whether the writing implied it, but it almost sounded like they were quite amused that she thought she would remember. And maybe you'll remember, maybe you won't. Am I correct in thinking that?
You are correct. Yes. And they thought it would be better if she didn't remember, that it would only cause problems for her and Barney. And
did they indicate, obviously not audibly, but within the mind, that you're going to forget this incident? Do they remember anything like that being imparted to them, or is it just Betty saying to these beings, I'm going to remember this?
I'm trying to think. The leader said to Betty, they took them to the vehicle separately, Barney first, right, then Betty. They wouldn't let her keep that book she wanted.
That's where I'll come in. There were a 7x9 or 5x9 or whatever with
symbols in it. Yes, it was a large
plastic-looking apparatus.
Yes, a thin cover. I think of a tablet today.
Yeah. Okay. And they were going to let her keep it. Then they changed their mind.
Yes, they said that it was the crew members, the shorter ones, who act as the guards, who said, took it away from her, said she couldn't have it. The leader said that, they made that decision. It was not my decision to make. And, the same thing. Could you come back? It's not my decision to make. That sort of thing. So I don't know if I'm answering all of that question.
No, that's fine. And it makes you think that there must be some kind of universal knowing within, we'll say the universe, within the grand sphere of everything, that if we were given, I don't know, something of substance from the beings of unknown origin, then if it got into wrong hands, for instance, or there's got to be some kind of universal law that applies to all of this, surely. I know I'm speculating. I don't know, do I?
But, I think their electromagnetic field was responsible for wiping out much of their memory regarding what happened on board that craft. That's what I think.
Do you think that were part of Barney's trauma within his mind, the not knowing, the gaps within what he did know, or do you think, did it do him good rehashing it all constantly? Although he probably would have done that anyway. He'd have been asking and asking and asking. There's not a night goes by without I'm not laid in bed trying to get a little bit further with what happened to me as a child. I've not got no further. I just can't do it. Yeah. So this is far more traumatic. And was it the not knowing that where am I going with this question? Was it the not knowing or the knowing that were disturbing him the most?
I think that it was the knowing that of these non-humans were threatening to capture him. He had that sense when he was standing in that close encounter field, and then the craft overhead, and then the physical evidence. And, there must have been some kind of body memory. When people have traumatic experiences, even if they forget some of it, that caused the most trauma, there's still that body memory. Yeah. And that trauma stays with you until you work through it with a professional.
Yeah. And in some instances, they probably just can't get past it because he knows there's something there that they just can't bring forward. You talked about we touched on the fact that there was some kind of residue left after the experience that affected probably other family members as well, as in almost like poltergeist activity, should we say? Okay. Can you tell us about some of that? Be as detailed as you want, Kathleen, because it fascinates me. It's something I always pick up on when I look at other people's cases anyway.
Yes. When Betty was doing her psychophysics experiments, a craft did come in. It landed on my grandparents' farm, 200 feet from my childhood home. It left physical trace evidence. There were 2 witnesses to it coming in. And after that, we began to have this paranormal activity in my childhood home. Light orbs inside the house that seemed to have intelligence. Poltergeist activity. Very strange thing. When I was in college, I took my boyfriend home. My parents had a boat that we would go on the ocean with to go fishing, and he was invited to come join the family. He lived far away, so he spent the night in my brother's room, and my brother was away in the military at the time. And in the middle of the night, we were awakened by him, his screams. He was very distressed. The coat hangers in my brother's closet had flown across the room and landed on top of his body. And so this was extraordinarily distressing. And for, as you can imagine, he went running out of the house. He did not want to return to the house, but we talked him into it.
And what it kind of commonplace for subtle things to be happening around your home after that C5, we'll say, experiment that Betty did?
Yes, and it happened in Betty's and Barney's home as well.
Okay, so in a way, it's kind of contagious then. Whatever did it brush off and impart onto the people that had contact with Betty? Do you think?
I know those of us who are close. I might as well say it now. I was asked if I've had my own experience. When that craft landed, my mother and I had vague memories of being on that craft.
Okay.
And then that's when the activity began in my childhood home.
So I mean, obviously, you might not want to go into much detail with that, but when you say vague memories, fair enough. We'll close that one then.
Yeah, I was on a table. I was terribly traumatized by my conscious recall of what had happened. My mother was terribly traumatized as well. Dr. James Harder worked with us in probably 1976 to years later, 1978, in that time frame with hypnosis. Much later, I underwent hypnosis with Denise Stoner, and also attended her support group for experiencers, and it was so helpful.
Yeah.
And I began to have memories of the reason for why they needed to take tissue samples from my body was because they were they were checking me for the level of toxicity in my body. Later, I found out that I lived just downhill, just downwind from what ended up becoming a Superfund site. Highly toxic chemicals leaching into the soil, into the water. I was 20 miles away from a nuclear base. There were above ground nuclear tests in the United States in the West, but they traveled on the air currents and it rained down over New England. The cows ate the grass and we drank the milk.
Yeah. So there you go.
Yes. So I can understand completely why they were interested in this.
Was there anything to make you think that it could have been the same aliens that interacted with Betty and Barney that you had interaction with? Yes,
when I remembered their faces, I knew that they were non-human, but I couldn't remember those faces for years. And finally, the conscious recall started coming forth more and more through self-hypnosis. And so finally, I did remember their faces, and they were the faces that Betty and Barney remembered.
Do you think then? I mean, obviously we can never know, but do you think it's over? Do you think these beings are observing you, other contactees all of the time, some kind of invisible presence that's observing us?
Well, I can tell you that in those 3 studies that I worked on, 2 of them were with PhD scientists, we discovered that more than 50% of experiencers believe that it's intergenerational. There are other family members. And what the ETs have been telling humans is that the proximity of the genetic line is very important to them so that they can observe changes across generations. So they're working to upgrade us. And they said initially they just took people randomly. And then when they found those that would survive the collapse of the Earth's ecosystem, that they began to work with those families cross-generationally.
All right, thank you. And now then, what are everything's the beings that you've had experiences of, but obviously you've got vast experiences interviewing other people who've had slightly different encounters, because it can't all be good. I know it weren't good for Barney, but ultimately probably it was for the good of Barney that they were maybe doing this. I don't know. But what about the darker side of it, Kathleen? Have you worked with people who've had absolutely terrifying or ongoing experiences with these things?
Horrible experiences.
Is it something that you want to share 5 minutes with us, just a little bit?
Yes, I can tell you a little bit about one of my cases that took place. It was he was a commercial pilot who had retired, and he opened up his own little airport in Texas. He was doing working on small planes. There, he had a crew working with him. He and his wife were living at the airport. They were going to build a house there. And one night he saw people outside the house, and he thought, oh, these teenagers out drinking, and they're going to be vandalizing the airport. And so he went outside, and it wasn't teenagers. They were adults, and they were pointing into the air. And he said that there were 2 of the brightest, most intense lights he had ever seen in his life. And of course, as a pilot, he'd seen a lot in the sky. Yeah. And so he became interested in this, and he tried to call the craft in. And he went up into his control tower, and he would shoot laser beams at them, and larger lasers he'd hit them with. And eventually they started coming down closer.
So he realized these weren't conventional aircraft instantly.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. He knew they were not conventional. He set up cameras all over his property. When he realized that they were not friendly, he started carrying weapons, and he started shooting at them. And it's a very long story. I've written about it in, Extraterrestrial Contact, What to Do When You've Been Abducted. It's one of the examples I've written about of the really negative cases I worked on. Also, I wrote about all different types of cases. But for this man, he knew nothing about ETs or this craft. He got in way over his head. He used violence against them. They used violence against him. His wife left him. He started to have negative spiritual entities come in, clawing, deep claw marks down his chest. He was sleeping with his gun. One night after he found himself being released a couple of miles away from his home, or away from the airport on the outskirts of town where his home was. He was in his underwear, barefoot, having to walk back in the middle of the night. This was very traumatizing. He had conscious memories of observing these entities through the door window down into the hangar. They were inside the hangar. Then he had missing time. He ended up handcuffing himself to his bed at night, putting boards over all the windows. He left his own bedroom and went to another bedroom. He did everything he could to avoid this. He ended up shooting one of them, and it just disappeared in a bright blue flash of light. And it left some kind of residue on his floor. And but unfortunately, no one collected that evidence for analysis.
But he poked the hornet's nest initially, didn't he?
He poked that hornet's nest, and he became sicker and sicker due to these malevolent interdimensionals who were entering as well. It was almost like the Skinwalker Ranch, if you're familiar with that. There was a portal. There were prehistoric animals observed on his airport, not only by himself but by witnesses.
So do you think then, Kathleen, by initiating contact with these unknown others and getting more than he bargained for, he'd opened something up that was allowing many other types of unexplained phenomena to come through? Do you think it was more than what he'd initiated contact with that was interacting with him?
Yes, I do believe that. I think that there was a portal that opened up on his property, and that anything could come through. Positive, negative, prehistoric animals, what you name it, they were coming through. And it's so important when you're doing these experiments that you protect yourself, that you're in the presence of someone who has knowledge about this, that you just don't go into it blindly, because you could end up with some kind of negative entity attachment. And he ended up with a negative entity attachment that he could not detach.
Poor man. That's Kathleen, I've realised that we do have some pictures that you kindly sent Les earlier. And can you just walk us through a few of these and where you were at, and just paint a picture for us, please?
This was one of my speaking engagements. I think that was down in South Florida at the time, at a conference being put on by Paula Harris, UFO researcher. I received the International UFO Congress Lifetime Achievement Award in 2021, and I was just so thrilled with this kind of recognition. So I wanted to show that.
And rightly so.
The years of work I had done. Some people claim, well, of course, trolls or debunkers say that I don't have any experience or any knowledge in the field, but this is
I think
some evidence that I do.
No, your knowledge is absolutely extensive.
Betty's and Barney's graves.
Okay, thank you. What's this?
After Betty's death, a man from New Hampshire contacted me, and he had collected a petition for the State Historical Marker Society to erect a state of New Hampshire historical marker for Betty and Barney up in Lincoln, New Hampshire. So then I helped him, and I had to send at least 24 pieces of documented evidence to that society to examine the books that had been written on it, the official reports, so on and so forth. And after several years, they actually did erect this historical marker. So I'm very, very pleased that the state of New Hampshire has officially recognized this event.
Thank you.
This is Betty when she was suffering from cancer in, I believe it was 2003, the year before she died. She was at that point, I think, beginning to have some radiation treatments, but still went to this MUFON meeting with me.
Thank you.
And this was at a conference in Rochester, New York. And this took place in 2000 or 2001, I believe. And it's me when I was much younger with John Schuessler, who was the Mutual UFO Network's executive director. At that time, he was a NASA engineer, and my Aunt Betty, who was speaking at the conference.
Brilliant.
This was taken in 1966, the year that I graduated from high school. I was with Betty and Barney and with Paul Fusco, who was the photographer for Look magazine. And he was taking a photograph of us officially for Look magazine. He attended my graduation and ceremony and then the family party afterwards.
It's fabulous. There's a moment in time. Yeah, of
Yes.
the books.
Well, let me begin with the one on the right, Captured. This was me at a conference out in California, holding up my book very proudly. I was speaking at that conference. And then years and years later, you see me at the Roswell International UFO Museum, where I spoke every year, beginning, I believe it was in 2008. And there I am again with my books and lecturing and being on panels at the annual conference festival.
Thank you.
On the left, you see me at my home now. It was Christmas time of 2003. And then on the right, back in, I believe it was 2012 or 13, where the MUFON Symposium awarded me that trophy for my work as an investigator and researcher. The photo was taken by Harry Drew, and he gave me permission to be able to use that as long as I mentioned his name. So
Brilliant.
Very good photographer.
And for the people that say you've not been involved in the subject, I mean, I think that's just speaking for itself, all this. So, you know, the debunkers and the trolls. So do we have, Les, before we move from the pictures, do we have a picture showing where people can get Kathleen's books? Brilliant. So all these books, Amazon, I'm assuming, Kathleen?
Yes, you can go to Amazon. They're available in just about all the formats. You can't order autographed copies from my website. I can only mail them in the United States because of the cost of postage.
Yeah.
Sorry about that, but you can order them all on Amazon. And
Excellent.
I hope you do.
Great stuff, Les. Thank you. And obviously, we're going to round up with a few questions. And I've got loads and I haven't had a chance to ask half of this. Look at this. I'm going to talk about the star map. But just briefly, because we're very early on into the conversation, you talked about the Air Force and Barney were waiting for a call back from the Air Force. How did the Air Force treat him after he'd spoken about this?
They treated him seriously, but later at Project Blue Book, the official determination was that it was probably an advertising light or the planet Jupiter. They altered the original report at Project Blue Book. They took out the original information about how it had moved erratically, how it had zoomed down over their vehicle, the buzzing sounds. They took out a lot of information, but fortunately I have the original reports. So when I speak, I show that evidence of the cover-up. But there were officers at Pease Air Force Base who took him very seriously and treated him with respect and became friendly with him and supported him and Betty. Also a naval officer.
It's fabulous. And it speaks volumes when you look at the whistleblowers and what's being said today, you know, only 5 or 6 months ago. that this original report was altered, by the people who are supposed to be looking into this in a serious manner. And it's probably the same type of thing, just dressed up differently, that's happening today. Has anything changed, do you think?
Well, fortunately, we have the internet. So information has moved forward, and the Congressional Committee is interviewing people in their investigation of all of this. But I'm terribly disappointed that the Pentagon has recently just posted a report with all of their old studies that simply dismissed everything, despite the evidence that it was real. And that's what makes me so angry, that they just dismissed all of it. Again, they don't want to be involved in this investigation. They want to do what they want to do. They're helpless to prevent abductions, for example. And, so they'd rather ignore all of it.
Yeah, but it's almost as though plans are set in place, I don't know, 3 or 4 steps in advance of what they're going to reveal afterwards. We've got the talk of the Navy and other military personnel talking about these craft and observing them. But then now we're seeing the release of sophisticated underwater drones and things. So that wasn't talked about. I mean, the people will have known about them, but that wasn't widely talked about. So we've had this information that's been put out, and it's almost as though, well, this will be the excuse for that. That's what people were seeing. Everything seems a carefully orchestrated plan to just keep us moving further and further down the road to nothingness. We're not going to tell you nothing.
Right. And then, the Defense Intelligence Agency took this very seriously at first. Lou Elizondo came forth with a tremendous amount of credible information. David Fravor, the other officers came forward, the radar evidence, all of this. Highly credible people, scientists who are coming forward with the truth through the DIA. And then the Air Force forced the DIA to release this false report. Not the Pentagon, not just the Air Force, but and so I think it's a terrible tragedy. They've also begun to dismiss all of this on television shows now, where you can go on. I've been on 54 television shows, and I was treated respectfully for most of them. They used my testimony. They didn't alter it. But then more recently, on some television shows, they have used my words out of context to make me look ignorant, to make me look silly. And I resent that they are back in there attempting to, just debunk all of it. It's misinformation, disinformation that's being put out dishonestly by the Pentagon, and I resent it.
I don't blame you for feeling like that, Kathleen. And I'm looking at the time, and we've probably got 10 minutes left. And have you got questions to cover the 10 minutes, Les?
Yeah, more than probable. Yeah.
So are you good for the last 10 minutes with questions, Kathleen?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Right. First of all, we've got to thank Martin Abbas and Madeline Wick for the monetary donation to the channel tonight, Paul. Thank you,
Martin. Madeline, that's very kind of you.
And I'm just going to scroll down to the bottom, because I really, really want to put this one up first for you, Kathleen. From Karen Beeman. Kathleen, bless you for keeping these truths and memories alive.
Thank you, Karen.
That's great sentiment. Thanks, Karen. So now I'll just scroll back up, and this one from Beer Monster. Hi, Kathleen. Were Betty and Barney ever visited by the MRB, Men in Black?
There was a report. I wrote about it in Captured, about a neighbor who was disabled, and he would sit out on his porch, and he saw men dressed in dark suits entering Betty's and Barney's home when they were not at home. And I've spoken about in the book, I've written about a lot more cases of this psychological operation to harass Betty and Barney, to really make them fearful for their lives, I believe.
Interesting, that one. Yeah, Joey Hayes, has Kathleen any thoughts or opinions on the Phoenix Lights?
I do. I think that there is sufficient evidence that it was absolutely real. It was a gigantic carpenter's square that was traveling across states, observed by thousands of individuals. Although the governor of Arizona initially covered it up, he was a pilot. And 10 years later, he came out and told the truth. And, and Lynn Kitai, who is a UFO investigator, she's a medical doctor as well, has done a tremendous amount of investigation and on this topic. And yes, it was a highly significant, real event.
And so you probably put me right on this one, Kathleen. The governor only came out 10 years later because at that point he was out of office, wasn't he?
Yes, he was.
Yeah,
mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that seems to be when they're, the most they feel freer to talk, obviously.
The same night, the Air Force, I think it was the Air Force, released some flares much later in the night to try to cover it up. But it didn't work, except for those who didn't want to believe it.
Okay, Matt Jones, what does Kathleen think of the Bigfoot UFO connection?
I haven't come to a definitive conclusion on it, but boy, there is a link. I know there is a link between the two. The question is Bigfoot interdimensional? Is Bigfoot entering through an interdimensional portal? Is this a portal that these craft are using as well? I have all sorts of questions and no answers, to tell you the truth.
Yeah.
Okay, and let's have a look at this one from Joy Hayes. Does Kathleen have any thoughts on the Montauk project?
Yes, that was also a very interesting project, but again, just like with Bigfoot,
you're far too absorbed in your own research.
I'm so absorbed in my own research. It takes, I worked on it for many, many years, more than full time, until I developed COVID, and then I'm part-time now. So yes, but I continue to do my work.
Thank you.
I would like to say that if you will go to my website, Kathleen-Marden.com, you will find the Marden-Barton survey on religious belief and extraterrestrial life. Anyone can take it, whether you're a believer, an experiencer, or what. You can take it very quickly, and we would certainly appreciate it if you would. We're going to write about our results when we have received 1,000 surveys. So
excellent.
Appreciate anyone.
I'll visit. We'll have a go at that. Thank you.
Yeah, well, everybody's going to have a go at that one. Yeah.
One second, Les. Sorry, Les. Can people remain anonymous, or have they got to put their name
down?
Yes,
they remain anonymous. We don't take names, website, or URLs, or anything. We do not. We ask for the year you were born, your level of education, and your religious beliefs.
Thank you. That's brilliant.
Okay. Right, Tony D. From Tony D. Hello, everyone. Kathleen, would you know if abductions have increased since 2019?
I'm sorry, but I don't know if they have increased. When I left the ERT in 2021, I'm still a consultant to the ERT. My husband was ill. So I have sort of stepped back a little bit from that research and that role. It was my understanding that abductions, the abductions had decreased, but ongoing contact had increased, and it had changed form, and that experiencers who had worked through their fear were having these ETs come into their environment. Maybe they couldn't see them, but they could feel an intense tingling in their bodies. These ETs would communicate with them telepathically. They were more likely to come in even to your bedroom at night than to take you to craft, because so many people have become ill, I believe, as a result of their repeated exposure to this other dimension that they go through in these portals to this craft. They've been injured.
Yeah.
Okay. And O'Connell, when is Kathleen next in the UK, please? Such a fantastic lady.
Well, thank you so much, but I would only work overseas now if I'm speaking at a conference via Zoom, just because I'm almost 76 years old. And it's very, very tiring. I have this post-COVID going on, and I'm no longer doing this traveling. Although if I were younger, I'd love to come back. I've been over there as a tourist a few times, and also to work at Gary Heseltine's conference, so which was wonderful.
They're brilliant. Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, and I think I've got to put this question up, Paul. Quick answer, please, on this one. Lee Roscoe is asking, what's the new edition of the moon landing poster in the Truth Proof main office?
This morning, 7 o'clock, me and my wife, Mary, we went to a car boot sale. And I just dropped on the paper. It cost me £1. And I thought, yeah, I'll just pin that up. Yeah. So, yeah. So that's the edition, Lee. There's no mystery to it. But I was just surprised to see it. And I thought, yeah, 1969, I think, wasn't it? So there we go. Thanks, Lee.
I've got to thank Jojo for coming in with a donation tonight. Thanks for that, Jojo, at the last minute. And I have no more questions, and I will leave the last few minutes to you two.
Well, brilliant. Thank you, Les. And honestly, Kathleen, it's just been, you can take that question off now if you want, Les. It's just been absolutely wonderful. And what if it were a parting question, what do you think the message was, or what is the message? But we know that there's different intelligences coming through, but the ones that your family have dealt with, what's the message that they're imparting, do you think?
Their message is the same message that they give to other experiencers, that they are here not to harm us, but to assist in our development. They're concerned about upgrading humans to make us more survivable in this environment that we're living in, and that they are concerned about human negativity, about human hostility, people against one another, that sort of thing, the warlike behavior. So that's their major concern. But, and the messages are fairly good. They say to experiencers, you are family, we love you. They heal people. I was healed from a long-term illness that I had. I've written about that in my books as well, not in Captured, but in my more recent books. So 45% of the experiencers who participated in MUFON's study, who were in the abductee group, which was determined through a test and evidence, said they had been healed by these ETs.
So there's many positives to this then. And
yes.
What a positive show tonight, Kathleen. I don't know whether Les is coming back as we just wind this down and say, from myself, thank you very much. And it's been wonderful. And I think Les will echo that as well. So I'd just like to say, from all our listeners and contributors, thank you.
And thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. And thank you to everyone for your questions. Very interesting.
Thank you.